Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to have a look at a few bars of a choral piece by William Byrd, perhaps the greatest of the Renaissance composers, particularly when it comes to writing choral music, and certainly the greatest of the English composers of the Golden Age. And in England, this was the peak time of musical history for us, when we had a vast number of composers. Alongside William Byrd, you've got people like Thomas Tallis, and you've so many others, Orlando Gibbons, Christopher Tye, Thomas Wilkes, the list goes on and on. And then for some strange reason, I think some of which we can account for, things kind of went off the boil in England. We still had some great composers. I mean, Henry Purcell came in the Baroque period as our great star. Then, of course, we had Handel, though we kind of inherited Handel from elsewhere, so does he really count? There were other more minor Baroque English composers like John Blow and Maurice Greene, for example, Locke. These other composers, kind of slightly less immortals, if you like, than Purcell, but nevertheless good in their own way. But then it really goes dry, and the next great English composers don't come along until the 20th century, when we meet people like Benjamin Britten and Edward Elgar. So it's fascinating that we have this kind of prolific outpouring of music in the English Renaissance period, and then really things go to sleep for a bit. So the Golden Age, and it's really exemplified by William Byrd, who lived a very long life. He lived to be 80 years old. He was born in 1543 and lasted until 1623. So that was quite an achievement back then, wasn't it? And we're just going to have a look at a few bars of this piece, Ecce Advenit, and you'll see it's a typical piece for 4 voices in a choir, a choral piece, a church piece, and it's got many hallmarks of this style of the late Renaissance period. The counterpoint being one of the most obvious things about it, because we're still in an age when essentially the construction of the music is linear rather than vertical. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea that you've got a line, that's your top line, the treble line, treble obviously being the word for the boys sopranos who featured in the choir. So you've got this treble line, then you sort of stitch an alto line and a tenor line and a bass line, but you're really thinking about the linear evolution of the parts. Of course, they have to fit together. The kind of resulting harmony has to make sense, but it's not primarily the way that Renaissance composers went about things. And that's a big change with what followed in the Baroque, because when we get to the Baroque, even though there's still a huge amount of linear thinking, contrapuntal writing, composers are now thinking much more about the harmony. They're thinking about the bass line, and they're thinking about, well, what are the chords? They're thinking about the vertical construction. And we even end up with this thing called the figured bass, which really tells us, well, what are these chords that are going on? The figured bass also describes a lot of the melodic movement as well. So we don't lose this linear thinking, but we start to think in a slightly different way about it. But here's William Byrd in a typical Renaissance fashion, thinking in this contrapuntal linear way. And often we have moments of imitation. So you can see, just looking at the opening of this score, the tenors begin, then the basses come in, then the altos sing, then the trebles come in, and so this texture accumulates. But before we get into the detail, let's have a listen to the music. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the Renaissance style, a snapshot of the work of William Byrd. So what's going on in this linear thinking? Well, you'll notice Well, the tenors are the first to come in, and they have this little figure. Quite slow moving notes, aren't they? And alongside that, we have the basses coming in with another figure that in many ways is a kind of counterpoint to that tenor line. It's much faster in rhythm. So we have this in the bass line. So those two kind of contrast with each other. They're not unrelated. I mean, the tenor starts with this rising fourth, and the bass sort of essentially starts with a rising fifth, but the bass line is decorated because we have all these other notes in between. And so they're not unrelated to each other. You can also see the first two notes of the tenor part in the first bar, G going up to C. Well, look at the bass line in the second bar, G going down to C. That's the whole inversion of that idea. So it's quite tightly packed, and I think this is one of the lovely things about William Byrd that we often see, a real kind of symmetry in the music and a kind of tightness of construction. And an idea like this where you think, well, the tenor's doing one thing and the bass is doing something sort of independent that sits as a counterpoint with it. But then when you unpack it, you realize that actually there's quite a lot in common in the design. But then what happens next? Because if we look at this alto entry that starts in the next bar, what do we notice? And then it kind of wanders off somewhere else. Well, these notes here in the alto part are these notes that we've previously heard in the tenor part, aren't they? And then have a look at this treble part, the treble entry. Well, that already sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because isn't that exactly the same as this bass entry? So you see what happens here. We have the tenor part with this issue sitting above the bass part with that little contrasting idea. And then we kind of had the parts the other way around with the altos doing what the tenors did and then the trebles doing what the basses did. So you see how this whole thing kind of fits together in a very compact way, contrapuntally. Then we start to move on and the thing evolves a little bit. But you'll notice as well that when we get into the fourth bar, well, what's happening now? We've got the altos starting off with this idea. Then what happens in bar 6? Well, we've got the treble line copying exactly the same idea. And you can see how this then unfolds. We get a little bit more kind of rhythmic development as the piece begins to unfold. You notice here the tenors get quite busy, don't they? With lots of lovely syncopated rhythms going on in there. It's quite kind of jazzy, really. Funny to think that all the way back then in the 16th century we might be doing some kind of jazzy rhythm, but that's kind of what's going on here. It makes the texture all the more interesting. And then some of that is sort of copied in the alto line here. And then you'll notice that we've got this dotted rhythm in the bass part there. Okay, well that's actually kind of what's going on here. It's just that it's in a different part of the bar, isn't it? So this dotted rhythm here then gets sort of used in rhythmic diminution. So you have this thing. And then later on here. And you see how the same figure is used, but this one finishes with that rising fourth. Same figure's used here, but this figure's finished with a rising sixth. So this sense of how things evolve. You notice towards the end of this extract, what are the tenors doing when we get to this point? Well, those are the same three notes that we had back at the beginning, aren't they? But the rhythm's being just slightly altered there with the first note. So you begin to see how things connect even within the space of 9 bars of this piece, which is why I'm just using this as a kind of snapshot. So that's one of the big features of what's going on with William Byrd and this whole Renaissance style, how the counterpoint works. Now, the other thing that we want to get into is what's actually going on with the tonality, the key of the piece, because when you listen to that piece of music and when you look at it, it sort of suggests to the listener that we're hearing a piece in C minor, but you might even hear it's sort of got a little bit of a modulation to F minor in it as well. So let's have a little think about that. Back at the beginning, it feels like C minor. You know, we can see it's got 3 flats in the key signature. Now we've got a B natural. By the way, originally this wouldn't have been in 4/4 time, and we wouldn't have been worrying about which key we're in. That's not the way things were thought about. I'm sort of reappraising it with the gift of hindsight, if you like. But as soon as you hear the opening with modern ears, you hear very clearly C minor going on there. In the second bar, you think, well, that's chord 5 followed by chord 1. Feels very C minor. And then going into the third bar, well, you know, this bar is looking like chord 1 followed by chord 5 again. And then we get into the next bar and we think, well, this is looking like an A flat major chord. So that's kind of chord 6. And then we think by the end of that bar, well, that's looking like an F minor chord, a chord 4. And then we're back to chord 1, chord 5, back to chord 1, and so on. So that would be 1 there, you know. So you can very easily analyze this in terms of a modern harmonic thinking. And you can very easily say that all sounds and looks to me as if it's in C minor. When you get to this bit in the alto part where you've got all these E naturals floating about, really this is looking like the key of F minor all the way through that bit, because now we've got E natural and this is looking like chord 5, the dominant chord in F minor, going to the tonic chord of F minor. And then of course the tonic chord of F minor is chord 4 in C minor, so that's how we go from this point starting in F minor back to C minor again. But that's the wrong way to look at it if you are thinking this thing through the eyes and the ears of the Renaissance and of William Byrd in particular, because they were thinking in modes. So they were thinking, am I writing a piece of music in the Dorian mode or the Aeolian mode or something like that? But by this point, and this is something that Byrd is a great leader in, we get into this whole area of musica ficta. That's when we're working in a mode, but composers start to say, do you know what, it sounds better if we kind of raise some notes by a semitone or lower some notes by a semitone. So for example, let's look at the first bit of ficta, if you like. Is this B natural in the tenor? Well, really, if we were working in a mode, then it should be a B flat. And that's what we would have expected earlier in the Renaissance period. By the time we get to this point, and William Byrd is one of many doing this, but he's a real leader in it, they start to listen to that with new ears and they think, do I really want B flat there? Or does it sound better with B natural? And they kind of quite like the B natural. So they say, well, heck, we don't need to be religious about observing every note of the mode. If it sounds better to have B natural, well, let's have B natural. This is where the ficta thing comes in. So they're not thinking in a key, they're thinking in a mode, and then they're thinking, but let's start using this musica ficta to change notes that make a sound that we quite like. So, of course, you see how this plays out, because when you get into the third bar, well, there's B natural again. When you get to bar 5, there's B natural again. And then when you get into bar 6, as we've said, you've got E natural there. Then in bar 7, you've got E natural again. So the ficta in the hands of Byrd is even beginning to move around. So we're thinking, well, we'll have B natural here, but we might have B flat somewhere else. We'll have E flat here, but we might have E natural somewhere else. So not only is William Byrd saying, well, I'm writing in this mode, but I'm applying a little bit of ficta because I prefer the sound of a raised note here or a lower note there. He's also beginning to think, actually, it's quite fun to play around with this, so we get some kind of movement. So the kind of mode is manipulated in this way, and then a little bit later we manipulate the same mode in a different way, or we get a different kind of sound. The whole point of this, though, of course, is that you can see that William Byrd is one of the great leaders in the breakdown of modality. Because while we have to see this as modal, because that's the nature of Renaissance music, we can see that these modes are breaking down fast because we've got all this ficta going on, and we've even got ficta within these 9 bars pointing us in 2 different directions, with the B naturals here and the E naturals there. So it's entirely logical that by the time we get to the Baroque period, composers say, hang on a moment, what's going on? The modes have kind of collapsed. So now we need to stop and regroup and say, well, we've really kind of done funny things to these modes. So now we've got these things that we've kind of organized this way. So we're going to call that major keys, and other things that we've reorganized that way. So we'll call that minor keys. You can see how it came out of this, because as I've said, if you're looking at this with the gift of hindsight, you think we're in C minor from the beginning through to here. Then it looks like we've modulated to F minor. We've even got a pivot chord, really, in later thinking. That C minor chord I've just highlighted in measure 6, in bar 6 there, it's called 1 in C minor, but it's also got something to do with F minor. So it's kind of pulling us towards the new key, you know. Or you could say, well, with an F minor chord following, well, that's also called 4 in C minor. So it's even got a sense of pivot chord about it. When we come to this F minor chord at the beginning of measure 8, bar 8, well, it's 1 in F minor, but it's also 4 in C minor. So it's a kind of pivot chord back. So it's perfectly possible to analyze this in terms of C minor with a modulation to F minor and a modulation back to C minor. As I say, this is the wrong way to look at Renaissance music, because what we should be doing is looking at modes and working out how Musica ficta has been applied to it. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that William Byrd is one of the forerunners in the breakdown of modality through the use of ficta that kind of leads us to this new place in the Baroque, where we're then going to establish our system of tonality, major and minor keys, that sustain us completely for the next 300 years anyway. And many styles that are being used today are still maintaining that system of major and minor tonality, even though other styles have moved off in different directions. So William Byrd is an amazingly prophetic composer. There are lots of other aspects of this you can look at. The way he sets the words is absolutely beautiful. The way he writes lines, they absolutely move you to tears sometimes. Beautiful melodic design. The way the counterpoint unfolds and is so symmetrical, and the way it all evolves and the parts interact with each other is absolutely remarkable. The way he sets words can be absolutely incredible as well. But fascinating that this area of breaking down the modality that is so prophetic, because it's leading us to this place where we're going to establish the major and minor keys from the Baroque onwards. So it's a snapshot of all that William Byrd was about, and of this prophetic nature of what's to come once modality has really broken down. So here it is again, the first few bars of Ecce Advenit. Well, if you've enjoyed that, have a look at our website, www.ecceadvenit.com. mmcourses.co.uk, where you'll find details of all of our online courses that go into much more detail on harmony, theory, aural, analysis, orchestration, many other things besides. And while you're there, click on Maestros on the home page, and that will tell you all about our very exciting Music Matters Maestro program. Lots of perks there, discounts on the courses we sell, but also other things, including the opportunity to attend our monthly live streams, where there's a huge amount of teaching input going on, where we can really go into depth on things, and also the chance for you to submit recordings of your own performances, to submit scores of your compositions, arrangements, harmony exercises, whatever you're doing. Ask all the questions you want to ask, and I'll give you one-to-one feedback, and we'll share all of that in the group. Lovely, lovely people in this group, very supportive, on a similar journey to your own, and it's just a great way to share in that journey with this marvelous global musical community.